So today we're going to be seeing how to use Excel and VBA to interact with data through a Google Doc. The idea is we'll set up a Google form, we'll be able to enter information into that form, have it go into a Google Sheet, and then we'll be able to bring that data down into Excel. But we're also going to see how we can push data through that form from Excel. So we'll be able to round trip data to Excel by going through the Google Doc. So let's start by downloading Google Sheets.xlsm from Learning Suite, and we'll take a look there. So I've already downloaded that. There's not much to see on the worksheet itself, so let's take a look at the code. So you'll notice that we have the parser class module in here. We'll be using that later in class. We also have a module called ModEncrypt that will do some encryption for us. We'll use that here at the very end. But let's start off by looking at ModWebQuery. So back in the early days, I guess, Microsoft really made the change about probably close to a year ago now when they first started rolling it out, where they're replacing the web query wizard that they had used for years and years and years with one that's a little more sophisticated, but doesn't do simple web queries nearly as well as the old one. And so the code that we have here, Create Web Query, is just based on code that used to get recorded when you recorded yourself doing a regular web query. It's very simple. You just had to give it a URL and then tell it what part of the page you wanted to bring back. And so this is parameterized to basically do that old style web query. The web query still works, there's just no wizard to generate the code anymore. So the parameters that we need here are just a few. So the destination is the cell where you want the web query to begin. So it's got to be some cell in the workbook. URL is the URL of the page that you're trying to pull in. And then we have three optional parameters. You can either specify to bring in the whole page or just the tables on the page. The default's to bring in the whole page. You can indicate whether you want to save the query or not. Now, the thing here is that this is actually going to create it's going to create a query object in Excel, and it will use that to bring the data in. So I've written this to allow us to get rid of the query if all you want to have is the data. So if you don't specify to save the query, the default will be false. It'll create a web query, it'll bring in the data, it will delete the web query, but the data will remain. And then there's another option to bring the text either formatted or in plain text. Truth is, I've never done anything but bring it in as plain text, but that flag was easy to set, and so I incorporated it in this procedure. So we'll be calling that to bring some data in. But to begin, we're going to need to create a form. We've got to create that Google form. So I'm going to come to my Google Drive. So I'm already logged in. I'm in the folder that I want to work in, but I think I'm going to create a new folder just for this project. So I'll create a new folder. I'll call it VBA form. And go into that. And now I'll just create a new form. So new, more, Google form. And since we are kind of right here at the end of the semester, why don't we call this a course review? And we'll put that in the title as well. And we'll just have a couple of questions. So first question is going to be, we'll have it be suggested new topics for future classes. And we'll make that a short answer. I'll duplicate this question, and then we'll just say other feedback. And paragraph, I guess, is okay for that one. All right, so now I should be able to preview this form and plug some data into it. So suggested new topic, how about working with barcode scanners? And other feedback, love the robe. And we'll submit. Now we can submit another response. Other feedback about sending text messages from Excel. And then general feedback, slow down sometimes. submit. Okay, so I'll come back to the definition of my form, and now I'll see that I have 2 responses. And I can look at these responses just directly here in the form design, but what I really want to do is create a worksheet or a spreadsheet to look at them. So I'll click right here, create a spreadsheet. Create a new spreadsheet, that looks great. We'll say create, and then that should take us to the spreadsheet form. So here it is. Here's the data that we just entered in, and as new responses come in from the survey or from the form, that information will go right here. So it turns out that if we want to be able to interact with this worksheet without making the data public, in other words, we'll have to authenticate, that's possible, but it's way beyond the scope of this class. So what we're going to see here is how can we publish this. So I'll come here, choose File, and choose Publish to Web. And not the entire document, I'll just do this response sheet, and I'll publish it as a web page. We'll say Publish. Are you sure you want to do that? Yeah, I'm sure. All right, so that has now given us a URL. I'll copy that URL, and now anyone with the URL will be able to find and open this data. So let me go ahead and open a new sheet and drop that URL in. And here's now just a web page at this long URL that gives me the information from this. So step 1 is going to be to use this URL to pull the data into Excel. Now this should be pretty straightforward because now that we've got a URL that has this data, we can use any of the methods that we've used so far for pulling data in. We're going to use a new one. We'll use this web query that we have here in Excel. So let's go do that in Excel. So I'm going to come back to VBA. We're going to be calling create web query. We'll do it from module 1. So I'll just create another sub-procedure. Let's see, we've got to get data here. We'll use that later in the example, but let me start by making a sub-procedure just called get review data. Now I'm going to call create web query here, create web query. And I'll give it the destination range. That'll just be sheet1 dot range A1. And then we'll also give it the URL. And I've got that on my clipboard still, so I'm going to just pass that in. So we should be able to run this, and it should pull that data in. So I'll hit run. That's trying to run. Come over here and look at our worksheet. And there we have the data has come in on our worksheet. So that's wonderful. One thing you'll notice is that it actually hides column A. It's a little bit troubling. So let's add another line here and just clear up that column A issue. I'm not sure why it hides column A. It has to do something with the way that web query works and interacting with the page that's coming back from Google Sheets. So sheets1.columns1 dot hidden equals false. Run that again, and that should pull the data in again and then make that column A visible. So we've got all the data now, so that looks great. All right, but our next task is going to be able to push data from here inside of Excel up to that Google Sheet so that we can bring it down later. So that's going to take a little more work. So let's go ahead and take a look at this form. So let me come back here to my to the form. I'll go ahead and submit another response. And so in this case, I mean, one approach would be for us to be able to automate Internet Explorer and actually bring up this URL and find these different text inputs, fill those in, find the submit button, and hit submit. That's going to be a little bit cumbersome, and it turns out we can interact with this much faster and much more efficiently. And so to do that, I'm going to actually take a look at the traffic that gets sent. I'm going to take a look at what the request is actually being sent to the server. So when the user hits submit, it's got to bundle up this information and send it to the server to record. So I'm going to use some of the developer tools that are built into Chrome to be able to take a look at that. So let's just right-click anywhere on this form and choose Inspect. And so here's the structure of this page. And we should be able to find normal kinds of things in here. So we've got, just the thing. Let's actually go ahead like inspect one of these. So as if we were trying to figure out what this text input, how this is generated, I'll inspect that, and that'll take me to the source of that particular control. We'll notice that the name of this control is a little bit unusual. Input text class, where's the name property? Oh, here it is. So name equals entry dot and then some number. No doubt if you're following along, this number is going to be different for you than it is for me. So in the forms that we worked with before, the inputs had kind of normal names, the username, password. Those were text inputs that were created by humans. This one's automatically generated, so it gets this weird name, but still name is going to be what is used to pass this value back to the server. So that's looking at the structure of the page, but what I'm interested here is looking at the network tab right here. So what this will do is it will actually show me information about what's being sent back and forth between the browser and the server when I submit a response. So I'm going to come in here, put another response in. How about automating Word, or creating a Word document? And love the class. All right, so now when I submit this, over here in this network portion of these developer tools, I should be able to see some information come in. So I'll submit. And now here in the network, we're seeing that there have been several pieces of information that have gone back and forth between the server and the browser. So this first one is the first one that went, so it's the form response. Let's take a look at it. And so we've got some specific information here. I'm trying to make this a little smaller. Here we go. All right, so here's the request URL. This is where that information is being sent. So it's being sent using HTTPS, so it'll be encrypted as it goes. It's sending it to google.com or docs.google.com. And then the rest of this is getting us to the resource on that server that is accepting that information. It's sending it by a method called post. Let's just talk about that for a minute. So there's two methods, well there's more than that, but there are two primary methods that we use to send information from a browser up to a server when we're submitting information from a form, and those methods are called post, as we see here, and get. The distinction is that if you're using post is intended to be used if what you're doing with the request is going to change the state of the server. It's going to change some information on the server. And that's exactly what's happening here. We're sending information in through this form, and it's going to get recorded on the server. And so the idea here is that we use post that way, and that keeps the parameters out of the URL. It sends that information as a part of the body of the request. And we can see that down here, the form data. So here's the entry, the two entries that we have, the two text inputs that we have, and then here's the text that I actually entered in. There's a few other options here, but this is the definition of the body of the request. Now, if instead of sending it with post, we're sending it with the other one, which is get, then all this information would be included up here in the URL. But for right now, it's being sent as a post request. We're going to look at a couple of things here. So let's begin by saying, oh, let me go ahead and bring this URL in. So let me see if I can copy it. And I'll come back to VBA. And let's make another subprocedure here. I'm going to call this put review data. And we'll create a couple of variables. Dim, why don't we call this URL as a string. URL equals, and we'll just put that, just that URL. All right, so this is the resource on the server that we're going to try to send that information to. Why don't we create another variable here called params, also as a string, the parameters that we're sending to the server. And for this, RAMS, this is going to equal the information that we're sending here. Now, this is structured in such a way that we can see it and understand it pretty well as humans. But let me come to view source, because this is the way that it's actually sent to the server. Now, we'll notice a couple of things here. This says creating a Word document. But if I look at the view source, it's going to say creating plus a plus Word document, or Word plus document. So part of the rules about sending this information to the server is that there's no spaces allowed. And so the browser follows a set of rules that says, all right, if I'm going to send information to the server, I've got to encode this in a particular way. So no spaces. I'm going to turn all my spaces into pluses. And let's see this next one. It probably makes sense if I had some other kind of character that needs to get encoded. So let me go back and make another request. Do another one here, submit a response. Let me come back to this and clear off that so we don't have two to work with. And so why don't we do this exporting graphics. And put a question mark. How about wearing a wig once or twice? The glare off your head is blinding. All right, we'll submit that, and we'll take a look at the request. So here's the first information that went back, and here we have it. So how about wearing a wig once or twice? We've got that question mark. So now let's look at the source on this one, and let's see if we can find it. How about wearing a wig once or twice? And there it is, %3f. And so that %3f says, hey, question mark means something specific in a URL. So you can't just drop a question mark in there. So we've got to encode that. And so what this is, the % sign says, oh, hey, this is an encoded character. And then the 3f is the hexadecimal representation of that character. So if I was to come over here to like an ASCII chart, we should be able to find %3f. And we'll see that that's the hexadecimal representation of the question mark. So let's see. Here's the hex column. There's the 4s. I need to find the 3s. %3 ABCDEF. Oh, here it is. The very last one on this column. So there's a question mark. And so that's just saying if we have a character that we need to send that's kind of a reserved character, or a character that's not allowed to just be thrown into a URL, then we have to encode it. So that's what's happening here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pull in not the view source version of this, but I'll say, I'm sorry, not the parsed version of this. I'm going to click on view source and make sure that I'm pulling this whole block in just the way that it was sent. And we'll come back to VBA and I'll drop that in as my parameters. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and create another web query, but let me go ahead and have a sheet 2 to put this one on. And this should allow me to make a web request, but this web request is going to have the information in it to record this entry. So let me go ahead and I'll just copy this line. Doing another create web query. This time it's going to go to sheet 2, range A1, and we'll just send it the URL. Now, we have to send it the information as well, and so one thing that we can do is that when a server is getting this information by post or by GET, there's two different approaches. By GET, it goes as a part of the URL. And even though this server is expecting to receive it by post, quite often, whether that information comes by post or by GET, the server can deal with the information. And that's the way it is here with Google Docs. So I'm going to start off by first sending this as a post request. I'm going to send it as a GET request, where I just include this as a part of the URL. The only trick here is that I've got to, after the URL and before I put the parameters, I've got to put in a question mark. So I'll add here a question mark in. That's just the way it's just the syntax of the HTTP protocol. And so then I'll put the parameters. So here I'm going to be passing the URL question mark, that list of parameters. I'm sending that off to the server. The server is going to take that information and then send back whatever it does, and that will show here in sheet 2. But it should then also record that information. So let's change something in this request. So instead of exporting graphics, why don't we say importing graphics, just so we can see that it's a different request. So I'll run this, it should, got variable not defined because my parameters variable is called params, not parameters. I'll try to run that again. There we go. So now that's running. When it finishes, it should bring whatever the server sent back and put it onto sheet 2. Here it is. Course review, your response has been recorded, submit another response. That should look a little bit familiar because that's what we get whenever we submit something. Course review, your response has been recorded, submit another request. And so that's showing up right here. But the real key is going to be, can we see that data? Import graphics being something that came in. And so here's the exporting graphics that I did by hand, and now here's the importing graphics that I sent in by working with Excel. And so here, I just made that request. We're using the same web query to send a request to the server, bring the information back. So that's pretty slick. But sometimes you're not able to send the information using the GET protocol. Let's go ahead and look then at this other approach at communicating with a web server. So this one way was to create a web query. That's just a tool built into Excel that knows how to communicate with a web server. But now what we're going to see is how do we use a different object. This one will give us the flexibility to send the request by post. So let's go ahead and take a look at this one. So this is the Microsoft XML to XML HTTP object. This is version 6.0. And so to be able to have a reference to this, I'm going to have to add a reference by choosing Tools, References. Now in this workbook I've already done that, but if you're just following along on a blank workbook, you'll have to choose Tools, References, and then scroll down and find that Microsoft XML object. This one's showing at the top here because I have it selected, but you'll have to go down and find it alphabetically. It's down here with all the rest of the Microsoft controls that are available. So it's down here somewhere. So once I have that reference made, I can create an instance of this object. So I'm going to call my object HTTP. It's going to be one of these objects. And this really is, it's kind of like a little browser. It's just an object that knows how to interact with a web server. So the one drawback to it compared to working with Internet Explorer, well, there's a couple of them. One is that it's totally non-visual, so I don't have the luxury of being able to see and look at what it's bringing back. There's no browser interface to it. And the second one is it's not very easy to maintain a state with this. So in other words, to log in and have the object know that you're logged in, and so that when you send a subsequent request to that server, it goes, oh yeah, this person's already authenticated. And so this works really well for pages that you can go directly to without having to be authenticated, but not so much if you have to be authenticated. Now the real plus about this is that it's really fast, and compared to the web query that we're using here, and compared to using Internet Explorer, certainly this is going to be blindingly fast. So let me go ahead and do the same thing here. So I've got get web data, which just pulls in some information so we can see it. Let me go ahead and copy this, and I will call this get review data. I already got one called get review data, so I'll call this get Google data. And let me go ahead and bring in, oh, there's one more thing I want to do. I want to kind of build this out just a little bit more before we get to this part. I want to change this so we don't have this hard-coded in, so that we can pass in these parameters. So let me go ahead and create a couple of parameters here. We're going to pass in the params instead of declaring it here, so we'll bring that as string. Actually, no, we won't. Here's what we'll do is we're going to pass in topics as a string, and then we'll pass in feedback as a string. All right, so now I'll need something to call this. Sub make new review. And now we'll call this and passing in a couple of values. Put review data, and let's see. Another topic that we might want to study, how about deleting data from a database? And fantastic work. Okay, so now when we run this procedure, we're going to call put review data. We're going to pass these two values into the string variables that are defined here, into these two parameters. So now what we've got to do is we've just got to be able to get those to come into my set of parameters here. So I'm just going to highlight the old one, importing graphics, and we'll just look at the way this works. Is here we have the name of the parameter equals, and then we have that encoded value. Then we have an ampersand, and that's getting ready for the next name value pair. So let me just slide in here some little tag that I can replace. So do topics, and then this feedback. I'm just doing a little string manipulation here so that I can get this built up the way we want it to go. So right before the ampersand, so between the equal and the ampersand, I'm going to put in another tag. So before we make the request, now let's go ahead and substitute this tag that we've put in here with the encoded value of whatever we have here from topics. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm just going to use the replace function for that. So params equals replace, look at params, look for something, replace it with something. So what are we looking for? We're looking for topics. And we're going to replace it with whatever is passed in. And then we'll do something very similar for feedback. All right, let me put a stop here and we'll run to that point. So I'll run, make new review. All right, so if I look in my immediate window, if I just look at params, we've got a problem here because the new suggested topic shows in here, but it's not yet encoded. The spaces are here, and those need to be encoded. And so that's what we're going to use our parser class for. So let's take a look at this parser class, and we've used this in prior classes just for manipulating text, and I've got a couple of procedures down here at the bottom for working with URLs. And so one of them is called encode URL. It just says, listen, there's a bunch of characters that are allowed to be a part of a URL. If it's not part of that loop, you're going to replace it with what it's supposed to be. So I pass it in a raw string, and it sends me back that string encoded so it can work in a URL. And it's called URL encode. All right, so we're going to create an instance of that parser class. So dim p as a new parser. And now I should be able to, instead of just passing topics in, let me do p.url encode. And I will pass that to topics. So whatever the user passes in, before I replace that in my, before I replace the tag inside my params, I am going to pass in, I'm going to take the topics, send that over to the URL encoder. That will come back encoded, and that's what's going to go in. So let me go ahead and stop this, and we'll run this code again. Take a look at params again. So now it's the same, but now we can see it's been encoded. It's put those pluses in here. And we'll do the same thing for feedback. And if we run that again, we should see that the feedback will now be encoded. So we'll run that. Just got to make sure we're on the right one to run. Take a look at the parameters. Now we can see that fantastic work. Instead of space and an exclamation point, we've got plus, and we can see the encoded version of that exclamation point right here. All right, so now the nice thing about this is I should be able to get rid of my stop and run that the rest of the way through. And that should now go ahead and encode that information and put it up here. So if we come back to our Google form, deleting data from a database, fantastic work. That record's coming just fine. Okay, so now we want to do the same thing, but using this other set of objects here. And so this whole first part is going to be really similar. So let me just copy everything from the beginning of my parameters here, the URL, the definition of the parameters, that's all going to be the same. So I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to put that right here in my Get Google Data. Actually, I don't want Get Google Data here. I want this to be Put Google Data. Now I don't need to define URL again because I've got URL declared up here. So now it'll be Put Google Data. I'm putting the topics, the feedback. We're building the URL and the parameters the same way. Okay, so now let's look at this new object. So we are creating an instance of this MSXML2 object. We've already defined the URL, so we don't have to do this. And so right now we are sending this by get. So this should work the same way as our last one. So instead of just URL here, let me do the same thing we did, URL ampersand, question mark, ampersand params. So I'm now putting the parameters as a part of the URL, and the question mark indicates, hey, there's parameters that are coming. The false here, by the way, says wait. So this is can be a synchronous or an asynchronous request. So if we want it to be synchronous, in other words, we're gonna stay here and wait until the page comes back, we want to put this as false. This opens the request and allows me to configure it, but does not send it to the server until I say send. And then once that comes back, then the information that came back from the server will be in a property called response text. So now if we run Put Google Data, it should do exactly the same thing as we did with our Put Review Data, except we're using a different object. Instead of using the WebQuery object to communicate with the server, we are using the MSXML2 HTTP object. So let me go ahead and make that call here. Instead of deleting data from a database, why don't we say inserting data to a database. And I should be able to run this now, and you'll probably notice that it happens quite a bit faster. So that's over and done, and that data, insert data into a database, that has made it in here into our Google form. So far, so good. But the key now is going to be, what if whatever server I'm working with does not allow me to pass the information using the get method? Well, that's one of the places where this object excels. So in that case, what I'll do is this. I'm going to change this to the post. Oops, let me go ahead and copy this. This one's working, so this is Put Google Data. Great. I'll make a copy of that, and I'm going to call this one Post Google Data. I'm going to change the method from get to post. And now in this case, I do not put the parameters as a part of the URL. So URL is going to be by itself, and instead I'm actually just going to send those parameters now in the body of the request. Now I don't need the question mark here because the question mark's a delimiter that says, oh, this is all part of a URL. What comes after the question mark is the parameters. But now, as I'm sending it as the body, I don't have to tell it that it's the parameters because that's what I'm going to put in the body. But I do have to tell it one more additional thing here, and that is I've got to tell the server what to expect in the body. There's lots of different things I can send in the body of a request, and when I'm sending form-encoded parameters, I've got to tell it that in the header. So let's go ahead and come back and look at our... Oh, there we are. Let's look at our requests. So right here, we've got a block called request headers. So here's the request URL. We're sending that by post. We can look at the headers of that request right here, and we'll see some interesting things. So method is post. We knew that already. But there should be something called a content type. Here we go. So the content type, this is a little flag that's telling the server how to interpret the data that is sent as a part of the body, that's sent in the body of the request. And so we are going to need to set that request header. So after we open this request that we're getting ready to send, and before we send it, we're going to say http dot set request header. And so we've got that same information. The header is called content type. The colon we don't need because that's just part of the display over there in Google. in Chrome, and we are then going to tell it we've got a new header for this. It's called content type, and we're telling it this is form in URL encoded data. And so that's just a little signal to the server that says, listen, when you look at the body of this request, there's some data in the body of this request. How are you going to interpret it? That's form encoded data. And so now when we send post Google data, that should allow us to have that data go in. It's just now, it's telling the server to look at it differently, and it's setting up the request a little bit differently. And so let me go ahead and come back to this. Instead of put Google data, we're going to call post Google data. We'll give it something different here. How about sending text messages or sending email from Excel? I'll run this again. You'll see that it happens very quickly. And we'll come back and we're sending email from Excel is showing up here in our Google Doc. So now we're pushing the data up using both the get method of communicating with the server as well as the post method of communicating with the server. And again, depending on the server you're actually working with, it may require one or the other. Well, let's just go ahead and get our review data again. And that should bring now back into Excel all of that data that we had pushed up there. So now we've got these multiple lines, including the most recent one, sending email from Excel. So that looks pretty good. And in fact, if this is all we're after, this is pretty good. As long as we're okay with folks being able to see the information that we're putting up there. And so anyone who has that URL, who gets their hands on that URL, will be able to pull down that information. So that might be okay in some situations, but in other situations we might be a little less comfortable with that. And so let's look at what it would take to encrypt some of this data. So one of the things, and in fact we deal with information that's kind of put before the public that we don't want folks to be able to see all the time. And that's the whole reason that we have the HTTPS protocol. When we make a request to a web server using HTTP, all that information that we're sending is going across the internet. When we say going across the internet, I mean it's going through the routers that make up the internet. And any person who's got a router that's part of the internet could actually log off that data and look, everything that comes through it, they could look and see what information is there. So usernames, passwords, and all that. And so what we do is we encrypt that data, and that's what the HTTPS protocol does. So what we've done here is I've given you an encryption module here. Let's take a look at it. And it just has a procedure called encrypt. You give it a string to encrypt. You give it a key to encrypt it. And then that will encrypt the data. You can only decrypt it if you also have that same key. So let's just see how this works. I'm going to come to my immediate window. Let me just say encrypt. And I'll give it some string. This is a string of data. And then I will give it some key that I would use here to encrypt that data. This is the key. And so when I execute that, it says, great, here is the encrypted version of that key, or the encrypted version of that data. I can decrypt that data. Uh-oh. See if I can get that to dock again. Come on, dock, you window. There we go. But I can now decrypt that data as long as I have the same key. And the key is just an arbitrary segment of text. And that will decrypt it right back. Make sure that I got that right. I got an extra space here, an extra comma I don't need. There we go. And so I can take that encrypted form, send it up, folks won't know what it is, and then I can decrypt it when it comes back using that key. And the truth is, folks, if I change this key even a little bit, I change the key from uppercase K to lowercase k, it's not going to be able to decrypt that at all. And so I can use this encrypt and decrypt with this private key encrypting scheme to be able to send that information up in a way that is not visible to someone who might be able to just download that coincidentally. So let me go ahead and take post Google data. I'm going to copy this one, and I'll call it post Google data encrypted. And all I have to do is I'm just going to encrypt the two values that I'm sending in. So I've got to do it before I encode it, because they're going to send back all kinds of strange characters. I want those to be encoded. So right here, I'm just going to encrypt topics, and I will encrypt the feedback. And so now, let me go ahead and call the encrypted version. And it should put this information in, but now we'll see that it is encrypted. So we'll run that. Oh, I've got to send a key. So let me go ahead and define a key right here. Dim, do as a constant. Const key equals my friend Ava Tomato. And I will use that key then to encrypt this, comma key. Then as long as I have that key to decrypt it, I should be in good shape. So we'll run that, and now we should be able to see that that data came into our Google Doc encrypted. So here it is. Now, timestamp we don't have control over because that's generated by Google when the data comes in. But in terms of the data that we have, that's now coming in, that if someone downloaded this data, they wouldn't be able to read it. So let's go ahead and you need to be able to decrypt this data. So I'm going to go ahead and replace this with all this encrypted data, because if we try to decrypt this data that's here in an unencrypted way, it's just going to get scrambled. So let me paste these same things in so that all the data comes back encrypted, and we will then bring that data in. Of course, as the data comes in now, it's going to be encrypted, so I'll just run this, and we should see that the data comes back encrypted as long as it's updated by now, and it has. So we've got that encrypted data, so we just need to decrypt this when it comes back. So I'm just going to write a quick little structure that starts in C5 and continues down as long as we have data, and it will do the decryption process. So let me give myself a variable here, dir as a long integer, r equals 5, do until sheet 1 cells, row number R, column number, what was it, 3, column C, dot value is blank, loop, R equals R plus 1, and then we're just going to decrypt that. So I'll need that same key. I'll just make that a constant here as well. Actually, I guess I'll make that a module level constant. That way I only have to change it once if I'm going to change it. And then we'll just say that this location is going to be equal to the decrypted value of that same location using our key to decrypt. And we'll do the same thing for column 4. So now whatever data we bring down should come down and then get decrypted. Let me go ahead and save. Anytime I go into a loop, I want to be careful. I'll put a do events in here just in case I accidentally put myself into an endless loop. Looks like it's okay though. We'll run that. It's bringing the data down. Hopefully it's decrypted it. And looks pretty good. We've got sending email from Excel came in okay. But some problem with this one. So what am I missing here? oh, I'm decrypting the wrong value there. So that needs to be 4. I've got to look at column 4 for that as well. Let's run that again. And there we go. So now we've been able to have that information stored up on Google in a way that's not readable, and yet when we bring it into Excel, we get it just in the same way that it was. And so that's some of the tricks about using Excel and VBA to be able to push data up to Google Sheets and to be able to bring it down. I hope you've enjoyed this video.